In this video, I'm answering again a viewer question. Marty asks me to do a video on liquid biopsy screening. He says, sounds too good to be true, is it? So in this video, I'm going to explore and explain what liquid biopsies are, why they become so increasingly important, what their advantages are, as well as potentially disadvantages, and what kinds of companies work on products using liquid biopsies in order to advance the healthcare and predominantly cancer screening. So if this interests you, stick around. Although I have a PhD in biomedical engineering and over 15 years of working experience in the healthcare industry, I do not intend to give you investment advice. Please consider your own risk profile before making any investments and research your investments wisely. I have previously made a video where I introduced the concept of liquid biopsies as well. I leave a card here as well as a link in the description below. As you can see in one of these images that are also part of the referenced video, you can see that liquid biopsies are really at the crossroads of many different technologies, all converging, which are modifying and revolutionizing the healthcare and the way that we deliver therapies. So if we go from liquid biopsies and follow the path through bioinformatics, which basically enables the analysis of signal and information that can be learned from liquid biopsies, we can personalize treatments and in the end also end up with so-called living therapies, which are, for instance, CAR T-cell therapies you may have heard about, which is one way of enabling the patient's own immune system with modified immune cells to actually recognize, target, and destroy cancers. Of course, all of this can only be enabled if the type of cancer can be very rapidly identified and correctly identified. And all of this basically can derive, if done correctly, from liquid biopsies. A liquid biopsy is essentially nothing different or other than a simple blood draw from the arm. And here you already see one of the key advantages. It is very easy and inexpensive to obtain a blood sample, which then can be analyzed. Circulating in the bloodstream are many molecules and biomarkers that contain valuable information which can be detected using so-called next-generation sequencing. Therefore, a liquid biopsy is far different than a standard tissue biopsy you may have had or heard about with regards to cancer screening, for instance, which oftentimes may have to be obtained surgically. The key motivation for performing liquid biopsy screening is in the field of early cancer detection. As you probably know, cancers, when detected early, have the best chances of being cured. And this is where liquid biopsies really come to shine, because there is, if you have the right technology, the right approach, and the right validation methods, really the possibility to learn a lot about possible cancers and probably in the future many other diseases which leave traces even in minute amounts in your bloodstream. Here I'm showing the website from a company, Grail, which was recently acquired by Illumina, and you can see their focus is really on early cancer detection. So Grail have been working on the circulating cell-free genome atlas study, which is already closed essentially, but they have enrolled over 15,000 patients in this, and basically involving patients with and without cancer. Now, why did they do this? Of course, in terms of validating their clinical trial program and the ability to infer if biological signals from a liquid biopsy in the blood, that is cell-free genome information, is indicative of cancer or no cancer, of course they need vast amounts of data combined, of course, with artificial intelligence data processing in order to have the baseline for what is normal and disease-free, meaning no cancer, versus then being able to identify those patients who have signs or clinical manifestation of cancer. So these efforts ultimately have culminated in the Galleri multi-cancer early detection test that is commercialized by Grail. And as part of this cancer screening test, they have actually been able to identify and then to screen for ultimately over 50 types of cancers, many or the majority of which actually do not have any um, screening tests to begin with. So here is basically the list of cancers. I'm not going to go through all of those, but you may identify a number of very common ones: cervical cancer, esophagus, for instance, and so on, stomach cancer. So this is really quite a substantial benefit for patients if they receive this test through liquid biopsy screening, and could potentially be aware, and their physicians as well, as to the origin of a potential cancer signal, as well as then what type of cancer, combined of course with knowing the signal very early. The chances of being able to treat this type of cancer correctly, of course, increase greatly. One of the key challenges when working with liquid biopsies is that the disease signals, cell-free genome for instance, that are present in the blood are drowned out by lots of other signals, and ultimately a successful test must perform extremely well in terms of specificity and sensitivity. This is where next generation sequencing comes in, and I have here the website open from Illumina, who have really pioneered this work. I'm not going to go much into the detail. All I want to say is basically that their next generation sequencing leverages a synthesis technology whereby the nucleotides are labeled fluorescently, and ultimately the detection of specific signals becomes that of an optical detection method. Of course, in reality, it's much more complex with the biochemistry involved in enabling all this, but I want to be really here very high level to allow you to easily understand basically what we're dealing with. So again, the key challenge is how do you detect a very, very small signal in a sample that contains many other signals and genome sequences, for instance. I would like to illustrate this point with a perhaps more intuitive example. First of all, how do those potential biomarkers for cancer get into the bloodstream in the first place? Well, you can think of cancer as rapidly dividing cells and rapidly growing tissues. In this case, they are like a sloppy construction crew building a house. The pipes are leaky everywhere. The material that is used is perhaps somewhat inferior, is porous. So bottom line is, when cancers start to grow, there's a lot of genetic material that enters into the bloodstream, and this is ultimately the target of liquid biopsies and next generation sequencing. So now to the analogy I would like to make here. The task ultimately is an optical detection method because next generation sequencing uses some fancy biochemistry for sure, but ultimately also a fluorescence that is added to the nucleotides, and those basically fluorescent signals need to be detected. Now imagine you're looking at a big picture. Here, the example of the HealthWealth logo on a large TV. The task to identify a potential cancer is to identify the one pixel that does not show the correct brightness or a slightly off color. How do you do this? One of the approaches could be to try and zoom in so you can actually see the individual pixels at a much better resolution. So you end up with something like this. Again, the task is identify a cancer. The equivalence here in this analogy is find the one pixel that does not show the right brightness and or a slightly different color that is not correct. If we zoom in further, the task may become a little bit more easy, but at the same time, we have lost basically the entire frame of the picture. So we have to keep searching far and wide across at this magnification the entire image until we may find the one pixel that's not showing the right color, which may be indicative then of potentially a cancer being present in the liquid biopsy. Okay, so let's now switch our attention over to the various companies who are working in using liquid biopsies to do early cancer detection. We already covered Grail to some extent, and I need to correct, Grail is in the process of being acquired by Illumina, though that acquisition is still pending the okay from the Federal Trade Commission in the US, as well as the equivalents in the European Union. A decision on that, I believe, is expected sometime late October or late November. So until then, the acquisition actually is not complete. Um, Ultimately, next company is Thrive, which is now part of the Exact Sciences company group. Thrive, just as we had discussed already, basically envision a future in which an annual blood draw can basically identify cancers and lead to early stage cancer detection. Um, Next company is Base Genomics, which also now belongs to Exact Sciences. So I'm not going into the details of either of the two companies really. Let me know in the comments below if you would like me to cover any of those companies in more detail. Right now, all I want to show is basically that there are many different companies working in this potentially highly lucrative field. Um, the last company I want to cover right now is Freenome. They also basically, of course, based on liquid biopsies, aim to identify cancers very early. And they see here, so they want to connect people with the next generation blood tests for early cancer detection, powered by the multi-omics platform. So the special approach here is that they are not only focusing on cell-free DNA or genomic information. Multi-omics also means basically the analysis of protein, and cancers certainly can have their unique expression of protein that also circulate in the bloodstream. We can also see here basically the analysis of DNA, RNA, and proteins, as I had basically mentioned, but also the combination with artificial intelligence, which I'm sure is the case for basically all other companies as well, because it is extremely tedious and almost humanly impossible otherwise to try and make inferences and connections between the billions of complex patterns that certainly these next generation sequencing modalities basically enable in the first place. So let's now put on our investor hat and ask, well, what's the market potential for liquid biopsies? If we take the example from Grail with their Galleri test, you can see here that the Galleri test is recommended for use in adults with an elevated risk of cancer. And those are apparently people aged 50 or older. The test is intended to be used in addition to, but not to replace, the standard cancer screening test that are commonly used in the healthcare industry today. If we look at this article from Fierce Biotech from June 7, you can also see here that it is estimated that the Galleri test could help to screen as many as 50 million people after its initial debut. You can see that the full FDA approval is aimed at 2023. And again, of course, the intended patient population, those with elevated risks of cancer, including those that are 50 years or older. Now, this looks like fantastic news from an investor point of view. So I'm, of course, very interested, but I'd also like to take the final part of the video to basically look at the point of view from a patient. From a patient point of view, of course, you would want to know as early and as soon as possible if you might have cancer. And as we all know, the best treatment of cancer is when it is detected extremely early. Unfortunately, that is not the case today, where many times patients seek the medical care and diagnostics actually only once symptoms have manifested, and this is generally happening in the later stages of cancer 3 and 4 when metastases make treatment extremely difficult. In this article from Swiss Re, an insurance company, I leave the link in the description below, is very interesting with regards to the impacts basically on patients. So for sure, early cancer detection using liquid biopsies could be a game changer. I don't think anybody is questioning this. As this article states, there's basically still a lot of activities going on, notably Grail work in the UK with a clinical trial that is ultimately looking at how does the cancer screening of up to 50 cancers basically impact patients. So they are doing a quite large study with the question to see whether patients with no traditional cancer risk factors would benefit from early detection. The reason for this is ultimately when patients, and you see here they will enroll up to 165,000 patients, of which 140,000 will be 50 years or older. So the underlying question is ultimately, does it make sense for everybody over 50, as an example, to receive liquid biopsy cancer screening? Ultimately, the burden, if a cancer signal is found, the regulatory status of most of these tests today does still not necessarily medically mean that a cancer is really present. Of course, the indication is there, but you can anticipate that the anxiety patients may have with a positive liquid biopsy cancer screening result is potentially quite burdensome until with the traditional methods, let's say histopathology, etc., the presence of a cancer can actually be confirmed. And here another summary from Swiss Re. So as we had already basically identified, the liquid biopsy is a new molecular technology explored to detect cancer early. What I wanted to show here is basically that, of course, we had said a liquid biopsy is minimally invasive, and that's a huge advantage. However, there is the point that a negative liquid biopsy test does not rule out that there is some cancer. So this comes back down to the question of specificity in the liquid biopsy tests, and ultimately a positive result in the test, meaning an indication that there is a cancer, is though also quite troublesome for patients, especially if there is no histopathological proof or evidence yet of the cancer actually being there. So also for physicians, this leaves basically a vacuum where patients who have obtained the test results from a liquid biopsy and that it is positive, indicating that there is potentially a cancer, yet by traditional means a cancer cannot yet be identified, those patients have to probably be monitored and perhaps emotionally also supported during this time of uncertainty until, well, hopefully not, but until a cancer is actually found by the more traditional methods of cancer screening. So until we really know how accurate and how reliable those tests are, it is really up to every patient to decide if they really want to know the results from liquid biopsy cancer screening, because they should also keep in mind basically how they're going to deal with some uncertainty resulting from either a positive or a negative test result. Likewise, the overuse of these types of tests can also basically be a burden on the healthcare system. So the question of overdiagnosis is certainly something that is likely, given the fact that a liquid biopsy, a simple blood draw, is so easy to obtain. The screening tests become probably less expensive in the future as well. And we have seen here some examples with the PSA test for prostate cancer screening, which also basically is leading to an overdiagnosis and can detect hidden disease where it may be asymptomatic or not contributing essentially to the patient's death. But when identified, basically, those patients also would then receive treatment and potentially unnecessary treatment. And as we all know, any type of treatment carries side effects with it. So this is another potential decision point that patients and physicians basically have to keep in mind and think about, as most likely in the future, liquid biopsy cancer screening will become more prevalent and perhaps the standard in medical practice. I hope you found the information I shared here about liquid biopsies useful for your own investment journey. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider liking the video